So the Ever Crisis closed beta test just came to an end last week, and the game is scheduled for a 2023 release yet. From what I understand, with this beta test thing, they picked who got in at random, and I guess I was lucky enough to get in. Now, I am a really big fan of Final Fantasy VII. It's one of my favorite games of all time, but I'm also not really someone who enjoys mobile gaming all that much, especially the gacha-style mobile games that have been kind of the trend for the last few years. I've liked some mobile games, but those are typically just ports of full games from various consoles. And, well, if you're lucky enough not to be familiar with what gacha mechanics are, basically think of it of being some sort of like gambling system for characters, costumes, power-ups, stuff like that can usually be purchased with some sort of in-game currency, of which you can typically obtain with your real money. These games are almost always free to play, but they still make a ton of money off of the in-app purchases. And Ever Crisis does have a gacha system in place for weapons here, but the beta system did not include any form of in-game purchases. However, before we go deeper into the gacha stuff, let's take a step back and look at what else the game has to offer. The main appeal of Ever Crisis, at least for me anyway, has got to be the story, and there is a whole lot of it here. They are going to be covering the entire compilation of Final Fantasy VII, so we'll be getting Crisis Core, Dirge of Cerberus, Advent Children, Before Crisis for the first time in English, and the game will even be including an entirely new story with The Last Soldier, where they've been teasing some young Sephiroth stuff in the trailers for the game. Now, unfortunately, the beta did not include all of these sections. We only had access to the opening chapters of the original Final Fantasy VII, Crisis Core, and The Last Soldier. And of course, they did not include the entire story for these games either, but based on what they did provide, it did give me a pretty good idea of what's to come in the full released version. Still, keep in mind, since this video is based on the beta version, everything in the game is still very much subject to change at release. The story for each game is divided into bite-sized chapters, and I guess that makes sense. This is a mobile game after all, so it's designed to be played for as long or as little as you want at a time. And that's fine. For the most part, these scenes are short and sweet, and they look really good too. Each chapter seems to include one explorable dungeon-style area that you can explore with random battles, chests to find, and these parts are pretty good, albeit very simple in execution. But outside of these, each section of the story does jump around, with a little bit of on-screen text to tell you what happened in between scenes. So there's no exploring of Sector 7, the Wall Market, or anything like that, at least in this current state. So no, this is not exactly a full remake of Final Fantasy VII, but it does hit most of the important parts of the story, and it seems to me that most of the story and dialogue is pulled from the original game and not the remake. So there's no whispers or anything like that, and there are even a couple new scenes with characters like Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge that are new to the original game. They're pretty neat, but not really crazy additions or anything like that. However, I like that it does open up the idea of adding new scenes to the main scenario of Final Fantasy VII. Perhaps they'll be adding even more scenes with other minor characters as well. And I do like the art style they use here. It's sort of a modernized take on the old 3D models from the original PlayStation 1 game. They are kinda chibi looking but pleasant, and I like it. It's very reminiscent to the original game, only with the models for the Final Fantasy VII characters being based on their remake designs instead. And they use this same art style in the retelling of Crisis Core and the other games too. It's actually really cool to see Zack and Angiel portrayed in this style. And I'm also pretty excited to see how they will do all the other parts of the compilation in this style as well, such as Advent Children. I mean, that could be pretty cool. So that's all pretty great actually, but there is a problem here in its execution. As you play through the main story of 7, you unlock chapters of Crisis Core, and then chapters of The First Soldier, but it's very easy to get locked out of advancing the story missions of each of these games without switching between them, grinding up characters' levels in various other side content, and by obtaining stronger weapons through the gacha system, and then keeping said weapons upgraded pretty much constantly. As I mentioned earlier, the beta version did not include any in-app purchases, so your only way to progress is simply to grind it out. Well, that's likely how I'll be approaching the final version of the game anyway. As I've already mentioned, I don't love gacha systems, but you'll be spending far more time in the menus of the game than actually playing it. But I know that these games do appeal to a certain demographic. I'm just a little worried to see how they will implement the purchases into the game. On a little side note here, the experience points that you gain from completing story and even side content is often minimal to the amount needed in between chapters, and you only gain experience from your first run, preventing you from experience grinding the same missions over and over. I'd say the experience system here is probably more of a hindrance than the gacha, at least in the beta version, as I was not really struggling to regularly pull decent 5-star weapons. And the game was pretty generous in obtaining the in-game currency as well as upgrade materials. But aside from the story, the other main focus of the game is the battle system, and overall the system in place here is actually pretty fun. You can tell they're making good use of the remake assets, and graphically speaking, it looks really great for a mobile game. There is a kind of turn-based thing going on here. You wait for your ability bar to fill up, and once it reaches a certain percent filled, you can use corresponding attacks. For example, using a single target magic spell like Thunder might use a small percentage of your bar, while using Cure requires basically the full thing. And the abilities that you can use are tied to the weapons that you equip, and your characters will also auto-attack in between these commands to chip away at the health of your enemies. You can also switch between offensive and defensive stances, which you'll want to do pretty often, as enemies will charge up big attacks to unleash on you. And you can also switch between your party members whenever you'd like. Then, the party members who you are not controlling use AI to keep up alongside in the battles. And there are even different levels of automating the combat for yourself as well. You can also switch between a standard and a sped-up battle speed. Because of the game's grindy nature and the game's occasional harsh difficulty spike, I often found myself using the auto battles with the speed increase, simply because it's faster, and the AI actually does a very competent job. Perhaps too good of a job, even. It's more like babysitting the auto battle system to make sure you are interrupting enemy moves properly and then selecting when the right time is to unleash your limit breaks on the opponents. This leads to a pretty hands-off experience, which I know is quite popular with these mobile games, and there is a whole genre of idle battle games, but I just wish it was balanced a little better to give you more incentive to actually play the game, and not just let the battles play themselves. Overall, the system is decent enough, and at least it's reminiscent to a Final Fantasy game. Now, I realize this might be coming off a little bit harsh. It's not to say that there are no positives here either. As I mentioned earlier, the graphics do look super great, and the game sounds just as good as it looks. They are making great use of all of the wonderful music of the Final Fantasy VII games, and they are even using all new remixes that sound really good. And there are also little bits of voice-acted cutscenes that are sprinkled in as well, and although they are currently only in Japanese at the moment, I do like their addition. And I wonder if there will be any more of them, or if they're just going to be used as sort of introductions to each different game. Overall, I'd say the game is shaping up to be a decent addition to the Final Fantasy VII compilation, but I would be lying if I said it is perfect. I am excited to see how the finished version will be including story from Before Crisis, which has been, as I mentioned, long lost on its English audience, and also don't forget that the game is including all kinds of new Sephiroth backstory in the First Soldier. So as far as story goes, there's a lot to look forward in that. I just hope that we don't get locked out behind paywalls or difficulty spikes. So if you're already a pretty dedicated Final Fantasy VII fan, then this could be a fun enough time waster. But seeing as the game is being marketed as a new possibility for a remake of the Final Fantasy VII universe, I mean, I guess, but it's similar to the Final Fantasy VII remake, in that you'll probably appreciate it a lot more if you have already played the original games anyway. And if you haven't, well then really I'd still just recommend you go play those games instead. But if you are a Final Fantasy VII fan looking for something to scratch that Midgar itch while you are waiting for Rebirth to come out, then this could keep you tied up for a little bit. It's certainly not a bad game by any means. Just keep in mind, if you hate gacha games, well, I don't think that Ever Crisis is going to be the game that's going to change your mind on that. But yeah, that's about it for this one. Are you guys looking forward to Ever Crisis? Did you get in on the beta at all? Do you hate mobile games? Let me know what all your thoughts on that kind of stuff is in the comment section, and hey, don't forget to like the video, or whatever. Peace.